You know how some TV shows and movies start with the end of the story? The movie starts with Grandpa and grandson sitting on the porch, sipping lemonade, and going through an old trunk of Grandpa's war memorabilia. The actual story is about Grandpa's adventures during the war. At least we know that Grandpa doesn't get killed in the war in spite of all the scary situations he's in. They show the end of the story first so that everything that happens along the way makes better sense. That's how this sermon today is going to work. We're going to start at the end of the story. The Old Testament character Joseph, he was the 11th son of Jacob, happened to be prime minister of Egypt, honored and adored not only by all of Egypt, but also by all of the nations that surrounded Egypt, because several years earlier, a huge 7-year famine led Egypt to stockpile food for 7 years. This famine hit that part of the globe hard. And during those 7 horrible dry years with no harvest, Egypt had food because of Joseph. And it was enough to keep not only Egypt, but the nations around Egypt alive also. So Joseph was an international hero, the second most powerful man in all of the world at that time. Now, the setting for this dialogue at the end of the story is in Genesis chapter 50. It's that Joseph's father, Jacob, had died. Jacob had asked his family to take his body back to Canaan to be buried. And in Genesis 50, verses 12 and 13, so Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. They carried his body to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre. This is the cave that Abraham had bought as a permanent burial site from Ephron the Hittite. Folks, that had been quite a funeral procession. The second most powerful man in the whole world, Joseph, along with all of the who's who from Egypt, accompanying Jacob's family to a faraway burial site. Well, after that whole group had returned to Egypt, Joseph's brothers were extremely fearful. Their level of anxiety was very high. Now that their father was dead, what would Joseph do? Would he finally take revenge on his brothers who had treated him so badly during the growing up years? Joseph certainly had the motive, and he had the power either to make their lives miserable or to have them brutally executed. The brothers schemed and faked a message from their father asking Joseph to forgive his brothers. So how would Joseph receive their message? With more anger that his low-down brothers would attempt to get out of their injustice that they had created themselves years before? Or would Joseph accept the message as if it had really come from his father and forgive his brothers? The answer is neither. Joseph had given control of his life to God, so he pointed out what God had done with his life. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20 says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people." Folks, that's the end of the story. You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. Last week I preached on being cheated, and I spent the whole week reprocessing a really big injustice that had happened in my life years ago, and it had been a difficult week. What had been done to me affected me and my family powerfully, and some of the results have continued with me to this day, and for that week before I preached that, it was not fun reliving that experience. But this week, the theme of the sermon totally flips it around. This sermon is called "Not Everything That Seems Bad Really Is." I'm not saying that what happened to me or what's happened to you, the injustices that have happened to us, I'm not saying those were good or that God set us up to experience them for some reason that only He knows. What I am saying is that the injustices that happen to us, when other people have tried to harm us, God did not allow those to destroy us, but God used those terrible experiences in wonderful and even miraculous ways to help us become the people we are today and to accomplish God's redemptive purposes in our world. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them." So let's look at the life of Joseph. When Joseph was born, he was his father's 11th son and oldest child of his father's favorite wife, Rachel. Consequently, he was immediately his father's favorite. You'll remember from a few weeks ago that Jacob's parents had chosen favorites from among their children, and it resulted in their life being a constant battleground. And Jacob carried on that horrible tradition, having a favorite wife and a favorite child. While the other 11 sons rarely did anything to gain their father's praise, Joseph could do no wrong. His father spoiled him, buying him fancy clothes like a multicolored coat, and Joseph milked it for all he was worth. He was so obnoxious that he reported a dream that he had. In his dream, he and his brothers were all harvesting grain, cutting the stalks and binding them into sheaves. In his dream, Joseph's sheaf stood tall, and all of his brothers' sheaves bowed before him. Joseph not only wondered what the dream meant, but he shared it with his brothers, and they automatically accused him of wanting to rule over them. What an obnoxious little brother. Everybody that giggled has little brothers, or they are the little brother. Then Joseph had another dream, and in spite of the bad reception his last dream had, he reported this one to his brothers also. This time, the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down to him. When his brothers and even his father heard about this dream, they all made fun of the obnoxiousness of Joseph. Not only was Joseph a pain of a little brother, he was also a tattletale. When the group of older brothers did something their father might not approve of, Joseph was quick to run and tattle. You know, that's not the way to win friends and influence people, especially when the people are your older brothers. His brothers considered him a spoiled brat that needed to be brought down a few notches. Once the entire group of brothers were out with the sheep, and Joseph was acting like his obnoxious self, and some of the brothers wanted to kill him, the others wanted to teach him a lesson, so they grabbed him and threw him into a cistern well underground. And Joseph cried and wailed like only an obnoxious little brother can. After a while, a caravan of traders heading to Egypt was passing by, and the brothers got the idea of selling their little brother as the slave. What a great joke, so they thought. But they hadn't really thought it through. They lied to their father that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal, and their father was devastated. His grief never ended, and family life was miserable for everyone. Those traders took Joseph to Egypt, where the spoiled rich kid was sold on the slave block. How totally humiliating for Joseph. The worst injustice in the world was happening to him. Betrayed by his brothers, sold as a slave in a foreign country. It was a terrible time for Joseph. But let's look at it from God's perspective. Those dreams of Joseph's were really prophecies of the future. You see, God intended to use Joseph powerfully to save many lives from many nations. But that spoiled, obnoxious little brother wouldn't be of any use to anyone. He was like a young, wild stallion that needed to be broken and trained. and an Egyptian political advisor to Pharaoh was just the ticket. Potiphar purchased Joseph at the slave market. Joseph was treated like a slave and quickly realized that here he was nobody's favorite. So Joseph dropped the spoiled rich kid syndrome in favor of a willing and obedient slave, doing whatever was asked of him to the best of his ability. Joseph soon began working his way up the food chain in Potiphar's household. He learned quickly, and it seemed that everything he was assigned turned out very well, and soon he was promoted to the top, the head of Potiphar's household. Genesis 37, verses 5 and 6. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. Potiphar thought he had won the slave lottery. But the biggest miracle was what was happening inside of Joseph. His arrogance was broken. He had learned to serve his master instead of being served. He had learned to work with his fellow slaves instead of lording it over his brothers. He had learned the details of many tasks he had been assigned, and he had done them all well. Maybe Joseph was ready for the big ministry project that God had in mind for him. Or maybe not. If you thought being sold by his brothers as a slave was the biggest injustice ever, then you've got to see what happened to Joseph next. Potiphar's wife had noticed Joseph's good looks and his powerful position in the household, and she decided in her boredom to possess him personally. She attempted to seduce Joseph, but when Joseph resisted her advances, she retaliated by lying and accusing Joseph of attempting to rape her. It was totally untrue, but she was the wife of a powerful politician in Pharaoh's court, and who were people to believe, her or a slave? Well, in most cases like this, the slave was executed. But instead, Potiphar had Joseph sentenced to Pharaoh's prison. Can you imagine how devastated Joseph must have been? First, he was treated with contempt by his brothers, sold as a slave, in which he learned so much and did his best, and now lied about and accused falsely of rape, barely escaped execution, but sentenced to prison for life. This kind of injustice has to be the absolute lowest point in anybody's life. If we asked Joseph at that time, he would have said that what was happening to him was bad, bad, bad. And it certainly was bad and totally unfair. But let's look from God's perspective. This young wild stallion had been broken and tamed and had even learned some people skills. But if he was to become the kind of leader that God needed, there was still so much more that needed to be done. It was kind of like Joseph had completed high school and college and had some entry level of wisdom and skills, but he needed so much more, so much more. And Pharaoh's prison became the management training program or college graduate school. At Potiphar's household, Joseph had learned to work with other slaves who did what he asked because he was in charge. But now he was in prison with people who were far from submissive, criminals, powerful people of the Egyptian underworld who had been caught and convicted of crimes against Pharaoh. This was a whole different world from what that spoiled rich kid had grown up in or what he had worked in as a young adult. Prison was a hard, dog-eat-dog world of survival. There's no record of those first years of Joseph living in prison. But we know that Joseph, again, was a quick learner and not only survived in this terrible situation, but learned to operate with this kind of people in an even more difficult situation. And again, he worked himself up the food chain. Genesis 39, beginning with verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. At the prison, Joseph learned politics, who's who and what's what. He learned to operate within a chain of command. He learned to manage very difficult people. He learned the details of administration. He eventually became in charge of all the departments of a government installation: housing, food, maintenance, detailed record keeping of not only supplies but also of prisoners. He learned to work within a budget, making reports to the big bosses, even taking responsibilities for employees' mistakes. He learned to handle criminal uprisings. You name it, Joseph learned to handle it all. And you know, prison is not a school that you can decide to drop out of. We might say that Joseph was a captive participant in this management trainee program. Usually when we see someone at the top of the food chain in an organization, we only see the perks and not the responsibilities and the criticisms that go with the job. Joseph experienced both, loved by some, hated by others. But still, he did his best and kept learning, and God enabled him to be successful. Genesis chapter 40 begins with the comment, "sometime later." Probably several years later. Genesis 40, beginning with verse 2, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. Now, these were a different kind of prisoner. These were highly politically connected guys with big egos who were used to lots of power. And now they were in Pharaoh's prison and not too happy about it. I can only imagine the abuse Joseph took from them as they whined about the injustice they had been dealt and how they were so superior even to a slave like Joseph, who was doing his best to make them as comfortable as possible. Both of these prisoners had dreams. Now, we all have sleeping dreams, and we usually give credit to either eating too much pizza or to some TV program we watched the night before. But in that culture, these guys considered this kind of dream to have a significant meaning. Joseph offered to listen to their dreams, thinking that maybe God would give him the meaning. So each told Joseph their dreams, and God gave Joseph the meaning. Soon each dream was fulfilled just as Joseph had predicted. One was executed, the other was reinstated to Pharaoh's court. The one who was reinstated, Joseph requests to him in Genesis 40, beginning with verse 14, "Please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so that he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it." You know, we see in this request some frustration and sadness concerning the injustices that Joseph had experienced. and Joseph's desire to be liberated and go home. Oh, how he hoped that this might be his ticket out of that bad situation. Maybe it could all be over. If only this well-connected former prisoner would help Joseph. We're not done with the injustices. Verse 23 says, he forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. This was bad, very bad. It sure seemed bad to Joseph. He had done his best and he was forgotten. Remember those dreams Joseph had when he was a teenager? Dreams about his family bowing before him as if he were a very important person? Joseph probably laughed at that thought now. He was a slave in Pharaoh's prison, doing his best at the work assigned to him, and he was very successful at it and was totally forgotten. At least that's what it felt like. But was that true? Had Joseph been forgotten? Was his life over? Joseph had no idea of all that God was doing inside of him to getting him ready for the next chapter in his life. Genesis 41 begins 2 full years later. God always has a timing, and he rarely consults with us about his timing. Knowing how God works, I'm confident that there were still some rough edges in Joseph that needed to be filed down and some deeper learning and skills that needed more development. I'm also confident that Joseph did not know that. While he was feeling sorry for himself about being forgotten, God was still powerfully at work developing this young man. God had a great plan for Joseph that Joseph didn't know anything about. While Joseph felt the injustices of life, abandoned by his family, wrongly accused of a crime he didn't commit, God was significantly at work preparing Joseph for the most amazing job ever in history. 2 years later, Pharaoh had dreams that troubled him greatly, and his advisors could not give him the meaning of them. Pharaoh was troubled, and nobody does well when Pharaoh is troubled. The official who had been reinstated 2 years earlier finally mentioned to Pharaoh that there was a prisoner who had the ability to interpret dreams. Genesis 41, verse 14. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Now, folks, at this point, Joseph had been in prison for several years. Pharaoh called for him, but first, a bath, a shave and a haircut, and respectful clothes. When Joseph was asked if he could interpret dreams, his response to Pharaoh was interesting. You see, in that culture, Pharaoh was considered God on earth. And if God was troubled by dreams that he didn't understand, how does a person wisely respond in a politically correct manner? Very humbly, Joseph deferred to his God. Genesis 41:16. It is beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. Folks, this was a bold and gutsy response. Joseph must have delivered it in a very humble and respectful manner because Pharaoh did not have him sent back to prison or sent to the executioner. God enabled Joseph to interpret Pharaoh's dreams and to add a suggestion on how to handle the disaster the dreams pointed to. I don't think we really understand the enormity of what Joseph did there in front of Pharaoh. It was a miracle that Pharaoh would even consider what Joseph said. This had to be a God thing, Because look at what happened next. Genesis 41, beginning with verse 37. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, "Can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or as wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command, and wherever Joseph went, the commander shouted, "Kneel down." So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all Egypt, and Pharaoh said to him, "I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval." Then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. He also gave him a wife whose name was Asenath. She was the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. So Joseph took charge of the entire land of Egypt. He was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. Let's review that day. Joseph woke up that morning in prison, where he had been for several years. It started out like a day just like every day. However, throughout the day, he received a bath, a shave and a haircut, new clothes, a visit to Pharaoh's throne room, a full pardon from prison, a new job as second in command of the most powerful nation on earth, a new fancy limo chariot, and a beautiful wife who would go on to become Joseph's best friend and most ardent supporter. Folks, that was a good day. But what followed was most important. For the next 7 years, Joseph created and led a new taxation system on all of the grain produced in the entire country. 20% of all grain was meticulously stored in government granaries. Can you imagine the criticism and outcries of injustice the farmers and the people of Israel inflicted on Joseph for taxing them 20%? Joseph had been prepared for this. He weathered the criticism and the public outcries and the threats on his life. At the same time, he meticulously did his job that turned out to be bigger than anyone had ever anticipated, because the crops during those 7 years were outstanding. Joseph not only created the system, but managed it well. You see, he had learned, first by managing Potiphar's household, and then much deeper by managing the prison. He had learned how to work with difficult people and powerful people and a very large, complex government project. You see, Joseph was not the same young man at age 30 that he had been when his brothers played a trick on their teenage, obnoxious little brother. God had used several really bad situations to make Joseph into the man for one of the biggest jobs ever on earth. While God had not caused the injustices to happen to Joseph, God certainly used them to powerfully mold and shape an obnoxious teenager into a high-profile world leader. Here's the bottom line, folks. God's doing the same kind of thing in each of our lives. God is actively using the injustices and the heartaches of our lives to mold us and shape us into what we're capable of becoming for His glory. Last week, the week before, I was pretty overwhelmed at reprocessing a major injustice in my life. This week, I looked at that injustice again, and especially how all the things that have followed it. While it was bad and wrong at the time, I can see clearly how God has used that injustice powerfully in my life. As I look back at what my life would have been like had I continued on that trajectory and compared it with where my life has taken me, what I've learned about God and learned about myself and people, and when I see how God has used me in various people's lives since that injustice, I am so glad that I am where I am doing what God has directed me to do. Would you please remember what God's goal is for each of us? Now, none of us are fashioned to be a world leader like Joseph was, but inwardly our character, the person we are on the inside, and the task that God has assigned to us. Romans 8:29 tells us that God's purpose for each of us is to make us more and more like Jesus. When I read about Jesus in the New Testament, I quickly see that God still has a lot of work to do in me if his goal is for me to become like Jesus, and you too. The Apostle Paul, though, offers this as an inevitability. Now that's a good word, inevitability. Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, and I am certain that God who began the good work within you will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns. Well, we're back to the end of the story again. At the end of the story, Joseph told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people." So what about you and your life and the injustices you have experienced? This is your assignment for this week. Review the major injustices that you've experienced throughout your lifetime. Think through each of them. What Christ-like quality has this injustice helped to develop in me? What wisdom have I gained as a result? How has this deepened my ability to relate to other people who have experienced something similar? As this event changed the trajectory of my life, what major additions have come into my life since then? That's a huge one. What have I learned about God through this process? And how has God used that tragic event to deepen my character and my faith? Here's 3 scriptures. Would you read them with me, please? First, from Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people." And then Romans chapter 8, verse 28. "And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them." And then Philippians 1:6. "And I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns." Now may the God of peace make you holy in every way, and may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless until our Lord Jesus Christ comes again. God will make this happen, for he who calls you is faithful. Amen. You are dismissed.